Trigonometry, finding a missing angle. So first, our sine, cosine, and tangent are what we're going to be using. So sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. Cosine is our adjacent over the hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. So we are still going to be using those same trig ratios, but we're going to be using them in a slightly different way. Because what we're going to do is we're going to find an angle when we're given two side lengths. Now, to find an angle measure when you're given two side lengths, we use what's called the inverse operations. So they have these little -1 coefficients. And the way you say this is the inverse of sine, the inverse cosine, and the inverse tangent. It can also be called the arc sine, the arc cosine, and the arc tangent. Same idea, inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent. So what I want you to do right now is see if you can find those buttons on your calculator. So if you're using an Apple device, you can find your sine, cosine, and tangent. And if you hit the arrow button or possibly like a shift button, it'll put the little -1 exponents to be the main ones. So if you look on the second row on the left-hand side of my calculator, you can see the sine to -1, cosine -1, tangent -1. If you're using an actual calculator, look on the sign buttons, look above it, and it might say, like written on the calculator itself, sine to the -1 and so on. So you're probably going to need to either hit the second or the shift button, depending on your calculator, to get to that part of the button. So we're going to be using those, and I'm going to show you in a second how we do that. So here's our first problem. We have this lovely triangle here, and this is the angle that we're trying to find. Notice it's a right triangle. Sine, cosine, tangent has to be with right triangles, okay? Now, if I were to look at the sides lengths of A and 8 and 20 in relationship to my angle, the 8 is the opposite and the 20 is the hypotenuse because it's across from the right angle. So the trig function I'd be using is sine. So I'm going to have the sine of x, because I don't know what the degree is, and that's going to be opposite over hypotenuse, so 8 over 20. So on this one, I'm given the entire trig ratio. I know it's 8 over 20. I'm trying to find the answer. So what you do to find x is you use the inverse sine of 8 over 20. So it's kind of like doing think about inverse, like addition and subtraction, or inverses, multiplication and division, or inverses. The arc sine, sine to the -1, is the inverse of sine. So the way that you're going to put that into your calculator is if you have a actual physical calculator, like a TI something, you're probably going to hit your arc sine and then put in 8 over 20. If you have any other calculator, such as an Apple device, you're going to go 8 divided by 20, hit the equal sign, and then you're going to click the sine to the -1 button. So I have to make sure I hit my shift, and then I hit my sine to the -1 button, and I get about 23.6 degrees. So I first put in the 8 over 20, and then I hit my inverse sine button. So 23.6 degrees. So x is about 23.6 degrees. And rounding to the nearest tenths place for your homework is just fine. So let's try this one. This problem, here's our missing angle. So this is the opposite, and this one is our adjacent. We're not using our hypotenuse, which means the trig function we're using is tangent. So the tangent of our unknown angle is the opposite over the adjacent. So if I want to find x, I'm going to use the inverse sine of 13 over 10 to find x. So I'm going to put into my calculator first my 13 over 10, and I'm going to hit equals. So 13 divided by 10. I'm going to hit my equals just so my decimal's in there. And then I'm going to hit my inverse tangent, and I get about 52.4 degrees. So that means that my missing angle here is about 52.4 degrees. Okay, one more. So on this problem, here's my angle. I have an adjacent side and I have the hypotenuse. So this must be a cosine. The cosine of our unknown angle is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So to find x, I'm going to use the inverse cosine, and I'm going to find the inverse cosine of 17 over 23. So I'm going to do 17 divided by 23 equals, and I'm going to hit my inverse cosine button, and I get about 42.3 degrees. So x is about 42.3 degrees. Okay, so hopefully you found those buttons on your calculator. Also double check, and I would do these problems on your calculator to make sure it's calculating it correctly. Make sure your calculator says DEG for degrees, not RAD for radians. You do not want radians, you want to make sure you have degrees.